Visible podcast. I'm Kieran. Today we're going to be talking about the unearthing truths about human trafficking in Northern Ireland and beyond. In this episode, we're covering the connection between human trafficking and poverty with a special guest.
My name is Charlie, and in this episode, I have the pleasure of being joined by our special guest, Sean Mulholland. Sean is a North Antrim MLA with experience in community and youth work. Tell us a bit about yourself. We'd love to hear more about your background.
Hi, Charlie, and hi, Kira. Thanks so much for having me on. So, my name is Shanna Holland. I'm the Alliance MLA for North Antrim. My background is predominantly youth work. So, I started getting engaged in community relations youth work. That was my real background, and my real passion was around bringing young people together in safe spaces to have difficult conversations. And then I joined the Alliance Party after years of shouting at Nolan and other political TV programs, and thought I had to put my money where my mouth was. So I joined the party, and then in 2015, I became a councillor in Belfast City Council, and then in 2023, I was co-opted to replace Patricia O'Lynn in the Northern Ireland Assembly for the Alliance Party. So I'm the second ever female that's represented North Antrim, and I'm the first ever mummy that's ever represented North Antrim in the Assembly. So something I'm really proud of.
Should be. That's wonderful. So moving on to some questions. Could I ask you how you think poverty relates to human trafficking?
I think that poverty is one of the biggest risk factors when it comes to human trafficking. And I think as well that that term human trafficking, and whenever we hear it, we think of these faraway places and these people who are exploiting people in the back of lorries and on small boats and all of that kind of thing. But actually, it's happening right here in Northern Ireland, and predominantly it's happening to young people and individuals who are experiencing poverty and who are living in poverty. When you can't meet your basic needs, you will look elsewhere, and you are at risk and vulnerable from people being able to tap into that and to exploit that. So if you are having issues putting money on or food on the table, if you're not able to meet your basic needs, then I think that you are more likely to say yes when these opportunities and these experiences happen. And I think when it comes to young people as well, if you have experienced poverty and then all of a sudden there's someone there that's being able to offer you things that are too good to be true, things that you wouldn't naturally be able to afford, or giving you a sense of like disposable income for a bit of work, or they're showering you with gifts, or all of those things that someone in that position might not necessarily then see, or make that connection that actually they're exploiting me or they're coercing me, or this is human trafficking. I think that that's, for me, the link between poverty and exploitation and human trafficking is the biggest link that we can see.
We've already touched on this a little there, but how may people in poverty experience human trafficking?
Again, I think it comes down to that myth busting that we need to do, that it isn't really far away. It's not something that happens on the continent or in really deprived countries. It's happening right here in Northern Ireland, and there's various levels of it. So in North Antrim, we've had experience of people being exploited into job opportunities that turn out to be exploitative. So in agriculture and hospitality, um, in car washes, in beauty, uh, salons and things like that. So it's those job opportunities that aren't being recompensed in a way that a job should be. And then if you look at other levels, you have young people who are being sexually exploited under the guise of a relationship. Or you have, in my previous role as a youth worker, what I would have seen young people particularly was around drug crime and criminal coercion. So where young people maybe have got themselves into a place of debt, they're then being told to do certain things or engage in certain activities, or do things to pay off a debt or to get themselves out of trouble. So we see that level of it. You see that, young people being groomed into criminal activity doesn't necessarily need to be around drugs or things like that. What we've seen in the last 6 months, even where young people are being coerced and encouraged into violent behaviour, into basically doing the jobs that the traffickers and what I would call the child abusers as well kind of direct from the sidelines, that they aren't going to get their hands dirty. So those young people are being coerced into that. So again, it's about that understanding that it comes in so many guises, and I don't think that that's something that's naturally talked about. And it's just about changing, I think, the connotation that we have with that word. So that's I suppose my experience or my knowledge of it.
Alliance has helped many victims of human trafficking. What might those processes look like?
Well, it was something that I've really been trying to focus on is around that the proper reporting mechanisms. So through the national referral mechanism, actually making sure that the justice system and our policing system is aware of what human trafficking actually looks like. So for me, that's a big thing. And actually, then that joined up approach. Um, a young person who is vulnerable doesn't exist in a silo, and yet so many of our systems exist in silos. So one thing that I've really been pushing for, there's a piece of legislation called the Children's Services Cooperation Act. And what that piece of legislation means is that departments, statutory organisations can share information, they can share resources, they can share pools of money to protect young people, to have young people at the centre. And I don't think that it's being used to its fullest. So that's the one thing that I've really been pushing for, because for me, I think we need a link between the Department for Health with social services and everything that comes in that, whether it's the health service, so people showing up with specific injuries or potentially victims of sexual violence, things like that. That also then needs to feed into our Department for Education and what is actually being talked about on the curriculum, what's being talked about in schools, what support systems are available in schools, what counselling is available even within the formal education sector. It also, Department for Education feeds into our youth sector. So how it's actually set up, how it's funded, because for me, and I know that I'm very biased because I do come from a youth work background, but I do think that informal education, so our youth work sector, is actually nearly more important in places like this, because it provides that non-formal safe space for young people, and that's where relationships of trust can be built up, and where you might find a young person actually seeking help or seeking support if they can have that. And then you have our justice system as well. And then on top of that, you have our Department for Economy. So you're looking at skills, you're looking at how you actually provide young people ways out of their vulnerable positions. So it's all joined up. And then at the underlying heart of that, which is a department that I'm connected with because I sit on the committee that scrutinises it, is the Department for Communities. And the reason that's so important is because that is the department that is the lead department on an anti-poverty strategy. And as I've said before, that is the key. Poverty is the key to opening up the kind of the context that young people, particularly young people, are living in, that makes them vulnerable to exploitation and to trafficking. So all of those departments should be working together, and that's something that I, as an MLA, have been pushing for. And then on top of that, obviously in Alliance, we have the Minister of Justice, is the leader of my party, Naomi Long. It's something Naomi has been working on in terms of particularly criminal exploitation and the scourge of paramilitarism in our communities, which obviously has a huge effect on human trafficking. It's something I've been working with her to kind of change the narrative on it, that we do talk about child abuse now. We talk about it as abuse of children or as abuse of young people, and trying to change. If we can change the language, then we can change how people think about it. So there's lots of different ways. But I want to see pathways out for young people, and I think that's really, really important. So I want to see better, safer housing. I want to see an anti-poverty strategy that does a whole life cycle approach and really looks at early intervention right the way through. I want to see better jobs. I want to see better skills for young people. I want to see a curriculum that actually looks to the future, doesn't just teach young people how to pass exams, that it actually puts them in a place that empowers them to go into sustainable work. Because at the end of the day, if you are in work, you will hopefully have a support system around you, you'll have friends, you'll have a community, but you'll also have income. And then that feeds them back into your risk of poverty is reduced, hopefully, if we can get those good jobs that actually pay meaningful, sustainable wages. But then we also need to tackle the cost of living. So there's lots of different things and lots of different ways that we can approach it. But for me, it's about making that pathway out of vulnerability, of vulnerable situations, and then making sure that we have all of our departments and all of our organisations working with the single goal of protecting young people.
Queen's University published a study that revealed 80% of children today live in poverty, with 8% of them in persistent poverty. How could these leave children vulnerable to the dangers of human trafficking?
Again, it all feeds back for me that poverty is that underlying kind of element. So when young people live in poverty, they are more likely to have adverse childhood experiences. They overlap so much in terms of the risk factors. And I think that if we have young people in situations where they aren't having their basic needs met because of poverty, they're at higher risk then of exploitation. And you have then a family circumstance that's under pressure or under stress as well, because the pressure that it puts on the entire unit, it isn't just on parents, it isn't just on young people, it is on the entire unit. It puts that young person at risk from isolation, from neglect. They're less likely to have to be able to fulfill their full potential in school. They're more likely to not achieve academically as high as their counterparts who aren't experiencing poverty. They are more likely to have health issues. Between the lack of good nutrition and also the lack of education about how to be healthy is heightened by living in poverty. And we all know, we've seen, I'm sure if you go into your local supermarket, you can see it's much easier and cheaper to buy processed, unhealthy foods than buying fresh produce. What kind of society do we live in where it's easier to buy a 90p packet of smileys than actual bag of potatoes, and so it's things like that. And then for me as a rural MLA, Northampton is obviously really rural. There's that added element as well, and I don't think that that's talked about enough. One of the things that I've really been working on in terms of that situation of poverty is the choice. So, for example, where I live in Ballycastle, we are closer to Scotland than we are to a big supermarket like Tesco's or Sainsbury's, where you can buy cheaper own brand food. So the choice for families, even in those rural communities, is lessened because you can only go to your local corner shop where you have to buy an £8 pack of Pampers rather than the £2.99 pack of Tesco things. So it's all of those things that feed into it. And for me, it's about seeing that big picture of poverty that then just adds that level of vulnerability to our young people who are in that situation. Because if a young person has a strong family connection, if they're not isolated, if they're physically healthy, if they're mentally healthy, if they're engaged in school, if they have just those support networks and they are able to fulfill their full potential, they are much less likely to be a target for traffickers, because that's what traffickers work on. They work on those, and they seek out those young people who are isolated, who are having difficulties at home, who can't afford the basic necessities. They're a much easier target, unfortunately, and that's the cynical kind of element of what traffickers are looking for. So if a young person can be lifted out of poverty, then they're less likely to be a target for those people who want to exploit them.
How do we try and prevent those dangers and vulnerabilities?
Biggest thing is social policy. We need to change how we do government. And the anti-poverty strategy is just one jigsaw piece, but it's a fairly big jigsaw piece. It's one of the reasons that I have been so vocal in my opposition to what the current anti-poverty strategy looks like. I don't think it's fit for purpose. We've waited 20 years. It's a legislative obligation. The department and the minister have broken the law by not providing it. And there's been judicial reviews about it. So for me, an anti-poverty strategy, again, that links up everything. So it links up our departments, links up our statutory organisations, creates a pathway out of poverty, but also is able to sustain and nurture communities. That's going to be the first thing. The second thing is around our education of young people. Again, that comes down to, like when I talk to young people, and even if you mention trafficking, again, it comes back to they think it's these drug lords in third world countries. That's the impressions. But if we are starting to talk to young people about human trafficking on a level they see in their communities, then you're raising that awareness. And for me, one of the first kind of protective layers around against human trafficking is your peer group, is your friends, because it is harder to hide something that's changing or something that feels a bit off from your friends. You might be really good at doing it to your parents. I think we all are. We're really good at hiding some things from our parents. But if you notice that your friend is in that situation, you're more likely to actually know where to go or where to signpost them if you have that education. So why are we not really embedding that information piece within our curriculum? So that for me, that's a really big piece. That, and also then youth work and informal education and creating those safe spaces for young people, because if a young person is in poverty, if they are at risk from exploitation, they're more likely to be isolated. So they might not be attending school, so they might not have that positive relationship with teachers. Maybe their impression of school is they turn up and they get shouted at for being late or for not having the correct uniform on. So for them, that safe space isn't there in their formal education, and maybe they're not engaging in like a youth club or a youth organization, and they're maybe getting in trouble in different elements of their community. There's loads of ways. So if we're creating safe spaces around young people, if we're creating these hubs, which would be my dream, that every town has a hub that is a safe space for a young person. If we have properly, adequately, long-term funded youth work and informal education, I think that we would be in a better position to actually see the changes, intervene early, and offer people signposts out and pathways out. And on top of that, empowering young people. So a young person is less likely to leave a risky situation or a situation that feels off if they've nowhere safe to go, if they don't have safe housing, if they don't have a good family unit, if they have no trusted adult. We know that if they're frightened of the police or they think the police um are on the side of whoever's exploiting them. So all of those conversations need to be had. We need more investment in work like Invisible Traffic that is actually doing all of the things that I've just mentioned, between that education piece, the safe spaces, the conversations that are happening. So for me, that would be kind of the main approach. And also just, I suppose, to really publicise that it's the power, the young people actually have more power than I think they're being informed that they do.
You spoke about the violence in Ballymena, condemning the actions of a number of instigators after the parents calling for a peaceful protest. Do you think the youths who participated due to older influences understand the dangers of forced criminality as a form of human trafficking?
Absolutely not. And again, it goes back to some of the things I've talked about already, is that if you asked any of those young people who were out in the streets, are you human? Are you being trafficked? Like, they would look at you, they no. So I think that there's, again, it's that narrative. Um, a lot of the young people wouldn't even know they're being manipulated. And I think with the rise and advent of social media and the platforming of certain voices in society that wouldn't have naturally had that platform, 10, 20 years ago, it's a lot easier for a young person to be manipulated. It's a lot easier for them to be drawn in, particularly when these people are really tapping into that fear element and that narrative of change that feels really scary for communities, particularly when you have what I see as an absence and a void of political leadership within mostly and predominantly unionist areas that we saw in Ballymena, because you're not having, I don't see it anyway, in terms of that leadership coming through saying, hold on a second, like, these people aren't our problem. It's our lack of education. It's our lack of investment in housing, social housing. It's a decade of austerity policies from the British government there's all of these things that have led us to be where we are. The fact that you or your parent has to phone 30 times to get a GP appointment isn't because we have someone coming over from another country. That is a lack of investment in our public services. I don't think young people are getting that, and I don't think that they understand that when you tap into that, because that is that fear factor, and it sells and it gets, like, you've seen the thousands and thousands of views that these channels get, and they're tapping into young people's kind of fear and also their desire for a sense of identity. There's pieces of research that have went on around community cohesion from when we were in the midst of the Troubles to when we're now in this relative peacetime, and that community cohesion has decreased because you don't have a common enemy. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's like that kind of community. So you have young people being isolated, you have their fears being tapped into, and you have something that will give them those dopamine hits. So if I'm streaming this, I'm getting loads of hits and I'm getting loads of likes, and they're tapping into all of that. And there's that feeling of popularity that comes with that as well. So there's a lot of that. But if you ask them if they're trafficked, they'll say no. And when I was a youth worker, it was 2012, was around the flag protests, and I remember being a youth worker for a youth group in East Belfast, and a young person saying to me, like, we are told that we have to be down at these protests, and then we look around and there's a flat on the top floor, and they call them the big boys, all the big boys are standing watching us, but we're the ones that have ended up with a tag on our ankle, not them. But if you asked him, was he trafficked, he'd say no. If he was coerced, he'd say no. And for me, that has been going on for as long as I've been involved in youth work. We saw it a couple of summers ago with young people having some drug debts reduced if they were engaging in violence at interface areas. It's these people in these communities know how to tap in and exploit young people. It's been going on for so long that it's normalized, and it doesn't feel like they're being exploited. But that's why I think we need to change the narrative, and we need to start talking about abuse, child abuse, then we need to start talking about trafficking, we need to start talking about the criminal coercive behaviour. It's one of the reasons that I am really proud to bring forward an amendment to the Justice Bill next year that will raise the age of criminal responsibility, so that these young people who are involved, they shouldn't be the ones that are getting the criminal records. At this moment in time in Northern Ireland, a 10-year-old, a P6, P7 can be criminalised for being involved in this behaviour. Now, you tell me that it's a 10-year-old who knows what he's doing and going out there and actually being involved in that. It's not. For me, it's about the people who are directing it. So that's one of the things that I'm really, really proud to do, is to try and change that law. But yeah.
We probably already touched on this a little bit, but even with the violence in Ballymena, it really feels like these problems are starting to snowball. So how can we sort of like slow that down?
Having difficult conversations, and we also need to hold our political representatives to account. We need more people saying, what you said there wasn't right, or we need you to stand up and say this. And I think that we need to have that tipping point where politicians actually realise the importance of their actions, the importance of the words that they use, and the conversations that they engage in. And we need them to stand up, and we need them to take ownership of the problems in their communities, in all of our communities. So for me, it's about that. It's about taking the heat out of the political conversation, and actually showing people on the ground that we can work together, because it's so easy for communities to be divided if they look at us as a political class, and all they're seeing is this bickering and squabbling and not working together. I didn't get into politics for that. I got into politics to make change and to actually make things better. People aren't seeing that. They're not seeing that mirrored. So for me, there's a big bit of ownership on me and my colleagues to change that, and hopefully that'll trickle down into our communities. And we also need to see a joined up approach from government and our social policy.
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation had posted about how it has been 20 years since we last seen a prolonged period of falling poverty in the UK. Do you think this means we can expect to see an increase in the vulnerable?
I think that's a real shame and indictment is the first thing. And I've stood in the assembly chamber and said that I'm actually really ashamed when I see the statistics from Northern Ireland, because poverty is a political choice. We've had successive periods where the assembly's been down, which is an absolute, for me, just a dereliction of duty. Um, so we need just to see that first of all. We need to see change. We need to see choices being made. But yes, I think that it absolutely factors that if we are seeing a rise in poverty, then we're going to see a rise in people who are vulnerable. And I think that for me, um, really points to why we need an anti-poverty strategy that's actually fit for purpose.
What could we tell them on this podcast that could help them in the future?
To have hope, first of all. I am a big believer that you always have to have hope to start with. Look for your safety nets, look for your safe people, or your safe spaces. Look out for your friends. Like that, I think that's the one thing that maybe if you are a young person who is at risk, or you are a young person who is being exploited, it's really hard to see that. But as a friend, you're more likely to see it. Educate yourself in terms of what organizations, what statutory organizations you can go to for help. Um, Talk about it. And also, if something feels off, just trust your gut. If it feels too good to be true, it probably is, but trust your gut. So if you feel that something's off, then trust that, because I think too often we double guess ourselves, and you put it down. You think, oh, it'll get better, or no, I'm reading into things too much. And also, nothing is too far that it can't be fixed. And I think that that's the big thing, and that probably feeds back to my thing of having hope, that yes, it can feel, if you are being exploited, if you are being in those situations, it can feel just totally insurmountable, that you'll never get out of it. But there are so many examples of when people have been able to seek help and they've got it, and they've been able to find themselves into a better place. And then, you know, the cycle doesn't have to keep repeating. You can be the cycle breaker, I guess.
Well, Shan, that wraps up our questions, and you've been so incredibly informative, and it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you, Kieran.
Well, Kira, what did you think about what Shan had to say?
I think the main thing I took from this podcast is it's so easy to just say yes to something when you don't have a lot, and just how easy it is to fall into a trap like that. What do you think about it?
I found it particularly interesting when she spoke about education, and we teach people how to pass exams and retain that information, but we don't teach them actually what to do when you get into the job, and how to carry yourself. And then if you can sort of lose that etiquette and maybe lose the job, or put yourself in that sort of like slope into poverty, you can end up putting yourself in those positions. Because I talk a lot about education in human trafficking, but I never thought about like how just education in general can really affect that.
Thank you for listening to the Visible podcast. See you next time.